hello. Yes, there's a voiceover this time, because this is kind of hard to explain, and also pretty boring. So basically, with, like, my whole EAH reboot and such, it's given me a lot to experiment with character design, and trying to make them unique and interesting, and I realized that I use jackets and hoodies all the time, and it was just like, this is a problem, and so I did this to, like, try and see what different combinations of clothes I can use to make something look interesting. It was about 2/3 way through when I realized that I could have just used a dress-up game as inspiration instead of going through all this. But I was almost finished by then, so I just kept on going. But I did this because, like, I kept on looking up, like, character design videos for ideas, and all of them were like, oh, use, like, color and shape language to, like, express emotions or whatever. And I was like, cool. What articles of clothing can I use, though? And so this weird thing was born. I think some of these actually turned out good. Some of them are kind of, I might use some of them in the future. But yeah, I think next time I decide to do something like this, I'm just gonna use a dress-up game. By the magic of How the Flying Squirrel, have a good day.